So just to let you know a little bit about myself, I am the Head of Public Involvement and Engagement at Health Data Research UK. That's the National Institute for Health Data Research for all 4 nations of the UK. And I'm also the strategic lead for the Public Engagement and Data Research Initiative, otherwise known as PEDRI. Not the footballer for those of you in football, but it brings together organizations working across the sector in data science to really spearhead public involvement within this field of data science, as it is less established than in other fields such as science, such as health, and some of the participatory social sciences and humanities as well. So I've had the pleasure of working with a number of the panelists in different projects and in different roles, and I'm very excited for the panel that we have today. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Simon Denegri. Simon is the chair of Sense About Science, and he's an independent which is an independent campaigning charity that was founded in 2002 that promotes the public interest in sound science and evidence by challenging the misrepresentation of science and advocating for honesty in public discussion and policy. And Simon is also the chair of the UK Clinical Research Collaboration, the UKCRC Clinical Trials Unit. Network executive group, which brings together over 50 registered clinical trial units from across the UK. And I've had the pleasure of working with Simon as well when we were both at the National Institute for Health and Care Research, where he really spearheaded a culture change in terms of how public involvement is embedded within applied health research. So we're really looking forward to learning from your varied experiences, Simon. And then I would like to introduce a colleague, Shada Kashef. Shada is the Senior Public Engagement Manager for Administrative Data UK and has been part of various initiatives from co-hosting the ADR UK Connecting Society podcast through to the creation of PEDRI. And Shada has been a champion really of public engagement in fields where there has been no engagement, especially with certain government ministries, and in the use of administrative data as well. So definitely looking forward to hearing about all the innovations that you've been able to achieve and spearhead, Shada. And then we have Jan Speechley, who is a public member that works very closely with us. So Jan is a member of PEDRI, but she's also the co-chair of the PEDRI Public Advisory Group. She's worked with PEDRI and HDR UK since 2022 and enjoys a wide range of PPIE roles across many different organizations. So Jan is passionate and committed to elevating the public role in data research and empowering patients and the public to understand and engage with it and see the difference that they have made. So very, very glad to have a well-seasoned public member that's been involved in so many data initiatives, and we look forward to learning from you as well, Jan. And then we have Joseph Lamb. So Joseph is a research fellow at University College London, Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health, and a data science officer at NHS England Data Linkage Hub. He currently co-leads and has led multiple public engagement projects on the topic of data linkage, including looking at financial and health data, the use of ethnicity data in refugees and asylum-seeking young people, health, educational outcomes of childhood cancer survivors, and adolescent mental health and data equity. So great to have the researcher perspective, Joseph, but also a researcher that's been so actively involved in spearheading public engagement as well. And then last but definitely not least, Helen Craig. So Helen is a joint head of public engagement at University College London and is currently working to redevelop the offer of public engagement and support that UCL has. Helen joined UCL in 2019 as the public engagement manager for life and medical sciences and has also completed a secondment with UCL partners. So before joining UCL, Helen created the role of Public Engagement and Research Officer at the Institute of Cancer Research. So that's London ICR, working as the interface between engagement and outreach and widening participation. So you agree with me that we have a very experienced panel, and I think this is going to be a fantastic and really engaging discussion. We're going to have questions until about 13:40. So I have quite a number of questions I'd like to put to the panel. And just to kick us off, maybe I can direct this question to begin with to Jan and Simon, starting with Jan. And if you'd like some time to think as well, Jan, then we can direct the question to Simon. So what does the culture of public involvement and engagement in data research look like today? And how should it change if we're serious about equity, trust, and public benefit?
I think today it looks like there is a lot of really, really good work being done. I think there's a lot of public involvement and engagement, but it can be very different depending on the organisations and depending on the culture in those organisations. It can be very thorough, it can be very engaging and involved throughout studies, or it can be quite tokenistic. And for me, I think the goal would be to get that parity across the landscape so that the public know what to expect when they get involved, and the people who are providing the interface with the public, such as the PIE professionals, are well supported, valued, and that it works and it's open and it's transparent and people know what to expect on both sides.
Thank you, Jan. That's a really great observation. And I know from working with you that you spearhead, in fact, I mean, this is a great kind of public initiated project around PEDRI and the standards that PEDRI has to further good practice in data research and statistics. You created a version of the standards that is a pledge to the public to indicate what the public should expect if the organization takes on or adopts the standards. I was just thinking, what role do you think the public pledge can play in this?
I think the point of the pledge for me was we were creating the standards for professionals and people who were working in that system. But it was one of those so what moments. Would the public look at those standards and think, so what? How does that affect me? So I wanted to be able to create something that was completely accessible to anyone who'd never ever been involved in any kind of data research before, and interpret how following the standards and embracing the standards with organisations would look to the public. And I hope that we've managed to embrace in one sentence what sits behind each standard, which has not been an easy task at all. But I think it kind of gives them a bar to look at of what they should expect from organisations that they're engaging with, or I hope that will be the case.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your leadership in that area as well, Jan. So I will pose the same question to Simon.
Thank you, Doreen, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. It's lovely to be here. I'm sure we're going to learn as much as, from each other as people on the webinar as we are hopefully going to pass on in terms of our own experience. Just to add to Jan's very excellent points, I think first of all, I think it's important to recognise that we have come some considerable way over the last few years in terms of what we're seeing in public involvement and engagement in data research and similar. And some of that's foundational. Things like the pledge, I think, are very important in providing platforms and foundational evidence, etc., on which we can base future work. A lot of it is quite project-based, exploratory, important to do, and a way of getting somewhere different, which is going to hopefully be better. So I feel with that happening, I feel very optimistic actually about the future, or I try to be very optimistic about the future, and I think we can be. I think probably the thing that maybe isn't happening, is that we haven't necessarily connected all the dots up, either between ourselves, and I think perhaps more importantly, we haven't connected ourselves to what's happening strategically, and by the leaders of organizations and maybe above and into government. So we hear very good things said and read very important things said about public trust. but I don't think we've connected well enough in people's minds that what we are doing here in this room and elsewhere is really important to the, nurturing of public trust and is worthy of support. And you can interpret that support in every way. So I think we've got a sort of internal job to do there. But I think some amazing things are happening, and I think the community is doing a really, really good job, often in very difficult circumstances.
Also, some really important points there, Simon, around the linkages to government policy and demonstrating our worth to the right actors to get that institutional and strategic support as well. So thank you both. Do any of the other panelists want to build on that or add any further comments? But I think Simon's comment leads us really well to the next section, which is going to be exploring power, influence, and support at the project level. So if there are no further comments, I have a question for Shada. So Shada, from your perspective, what needs to change in how researchers are supported to embed public engagement in their data projects, and how could that shift help build a wider culture of engagement across the sector?
Thanks, Doreen, and thank you everyone for joining the webinar. I think there's a few different strands of change that need to happen. I think one, speaking as someone who works very closely with researchers, and I'm sure a lot of my public involvement and engagement colleagues already do this, but it's kind of around not assuming knowledge of any kind. The more I work with researchers who are unfamiliar with this territory, the more I become aware that it might sound a bit ridiculous, but even drafting an email to someone who represents the public can feel intimidating around the language, the focus. How do we address that power imbalance, or how do we create equity there in sort of evidencing a feedback loop in the ask? And I think support from that stage of helping researchers with pretty much the admin and the planning, I think can go a really long way, because I've seen that once researchers get that confidence, then they really fly with it. But in sort of getting them to that stage is really, really important. And then the other thing is, I think I think that there needs to be some passing down of information from researchers to researchers. I think there needs to be that kind of peer-to-peer support. I've seen some really incredible examples of engagement that has led to thinking of categorizing data differently or defining terms differently. And I really want to see more of that information being passed down to next users of the data, in addition to the potential of the data and recommendations for expansion of the data or whatever else is passed on. And I think I had a thought and I lost it. But broadly, I think there's two strands there. It's that sort of like really strong support and being available, and then the other side is researchers passing that information and contacts. That was the other thing, passing information and contacts down to the rest of the community, just as they would tips around data use and access.
Really important points, Shada. And I really liked your suggestion around passing on knowledge, because it reduces so much duplication of effort. And also the involvement and engagement that has happened with the public then, I think, has a legacy beyond that project. So that's really great. So at PEDRI we have a resource hub. And one of the things is we're trying to work on the point that you raised actually about the contacts, because you build contacts, you build relationships, and it's great to perpetuate that onto other projects. But your point around making sure that the knowledge of the engagement is passed on, and I think a onus then perhaps for researchers to publish what they're doing, but for us to make that easy to engage with, and also not limit access through a paywall as well, I think is another thing for me there. I might go to Joe next as a researcher. Any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, first to say, really humbled to be invited to the panel and see Helen and Shada and many others who've helped me so much when I first started my journey of learning to engage with the public in data research. I absolutely hear what Shada is saying about the two strands of support that researchers need. I think, for example, Simon's early work and involved in helping establish that guidelines and expectations and resourcing is really quite crucial at the earlier stage when researchers need to plan around their budget and their timeline, how that works. And of course, with PEDRI's best practice recommendations, I think we are getting much better and better in terms of knowing what type of knowledge is needed. But there's another type of knowledge I see that perhaps hasn't yet been fully been shared and partially could come from sort of passing on knowledge from one research to another, but it's the interpersonal skills and expectations, right? So sometimes I would hear, um, well, other researchers may say, okay, you've done this job really well. Well, that's just a job for people who are really good at, public facing work. And then I'm not that good at this. Maybe we can work together. Well, that on itself is great, but perhaps it's that shifting of the dial to think that it is really a responsibility for everyone to take that step and to build that relationship. So I think there are skill-based best practice, but also interpersonal based ones that are more tricky to, I guess, bake into the guidelines and training.
That's such an important point. And I think definitely when I was working more face-to-face with researchers, that was a key, barrier for a lot of people, including well-seasoned professionals and professors, because often this isn't taught. It's something you need to learn by doing. So that's a really important point. If I can expand on the point you've just actually raised, Joe, if I could ask Helen, how do we support people who want to lead this change and do this really well, but don't feel empowered?
Oh, thank you. And yeah, I also feel really privileged to be here and to hear so many people who've really been out there walking the walk. I think people who want to get started, it's a really common thing to contact. I think, going back to Joseph's point, we tend to maybe default to a sort of one size fits all idea of involvement, engagement, where it's going to be everybody sitting in a room and talking, and maybe there'll be some Lego if you're lucky, or some post-it notes or something. But that doesn't actually work well for everyone, especially if you're neurodivergent. And that goes both ways, actually, as well for both researchers, but also for the people you're trying to engage with. So I think whenever anybody who comes to me who's never done this work before, I always sit down and say, what do you want to get out of it? What's your goal? And I think being strongly goal orientated is the key thing also to attracting a more diverse audience, because I think you've got to slightly sell it. You've got to say this is going to make a change. We're not just going to do this because we want to talk to you. We're going to listen to what you say. And I love seeing that in that PEDRI pledge, that it's not just about doing the engagement, but it's about what you're going to do with what you get back. So I think introducing people to that when they start, really trying to make it clear that this is a piece of work that should be mutually beneficial both to yourself and to the people you're engaging with. And then, people have made really excellent points about just making onboarding easier, resources, the work Jan's doing, to help people who've never done this before, because it is complicated as well. It's not something maybe you ever come across. And sort of explaining why you're doing it and what you want, what people want from you, is I think especially important among maybe communities that have historically not been treated well by the research establishment, that have perhaps reason to be slightly less high trust themselves. It's just so important to be clear about what you want and why you're doing it, and to recognise the great gift that you're getting when you do engagement. So good training, good introductions, and good contacts. That's the number one thing people come to me, is they say, I just don't know where to find people. So building those communities as well.
Thank you so much, Helen. And I will actually stick with Helen unless Jan or Simon, you wanted to come in on that question.
I just wanted to say one quick thing around the sort of power. I think it's really important that we remember that if you take a already well-defined project to the public, you're ready, or if we do the travel analogy, you're already sat on the bus in the comfiest seats, and they're still dragging their cases on and struggling to find a seat. I think it's when we go out to the public before that plan is formulated and we formulate it together, then straight away from the very beginning, there's a power share there and we all get a share of the comfy seats.
Like that. I like my comfy seat, so I like that analogy, Jen. Thank you very much, everyone. So, Helen, your point really links really well to the next question and the next theme. So we're going to be looking at inclusion and representation and data science. So your work focuses on co-production and inclusive practice. And our skills webinar earlier this year touched on various aspects of this in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So we looked at, for example, equality impact assessments. We looked at trauma-informed approaches to engaging minority ethnic communities. And while we want to support our audience to develop, skills and ultimately to serve underserved communities better, the underserved communities will remain underserved unless we use inclusive approaches that are embedded throughout the organization, right down to the internal platforms and processes that we have. And often those processes and platforms are outside of our individual control, especially if you are a practitioner or researcher that's trying to do things well. So what is your perspective on how our community can begin to embed inclusive practices when working with audiences, particularly those that have historically been left out of data conversations, and bring others, especially in our organizations, along with our journey?
No, thank you. So I'm part of the co-production and public engagement team at UCL. So I sit within the wider co-production collective, which is a wonderful community of people from within and outside of academia, sort of dedicated to the goal, advancing the goal of the co-production of research and sort of equal power sharing. So these are questions we think about a lot. I don't think we have all the answers because we are within all these systems, as you say, as we all are. I think fundamentally it comes down to trying to live your values and to be thoughtful and sort of mindful about what you do. So there's no one size fits all, we always say, especially for inclusion, because different people are going to need different things. And as I mentioned, what might be perfect for some people, like a sort of play-based intervention where you're building stuff with Lego blocks and things, could be another person's absolute nightmare scenario. It's far too loud, it's far too over approaching. So talking to people, not being embarrassed to have these conversations, just being very open and human. What can we do that makes it easier for you to work with us? What do you need? And I think sometimes meeting people where they're at is really important. Dan, you mentioned this, trying as much as you can to making sure that everyone has that comfy seat on the bus and you're not just bringing people in when things are already fully formed. It links a bit to what I was saying. There's no point in doing public engagement if actually everything's already changed and all you're trying to do is sort of convince people that it's a good thing that you're doing and that, yes, you should be totally happy about whatever's going on with your data. They have to be involved early enough to have the possibility to actually make a change, to do something. I think working with community groups or working with sort of gatekeepers and building relationships with those sort of stakeholders is really key for getting into sort of historically underserved populations, just because you can't rely on the previous methods you might have used sort of to reach sort of friends and friends of friends. So, being open to creating new contacts, being open to recognizing those groups and bringing them in, as we do in the co-production collective, working in equal partnership with groups of people who maybe represent people who will be affected by the research that's being done. And there's no substitute just for spending the time. We always do say that you can't, there will be problems. So much of it is about figuring stuff out and how to work together in a new context, and everybody's doing that at the same time. So just as much as you can, I think the way that we could all bring ourselves with that is to have conversations as much as we can with our senior leadership about just how important these relationships are to build and the time and resource that needs to be given to building them, and sort of selling how important that is, I suppose, and explaining that is how you get this work to do, and there isn't really a substitute for it.
Thank you so much, Helen. Lots of nodding of heads from all of us as you spoke there. I would like to go to Shada next, actually. You've had a really big job in terms of changing culture at kind of governmental level with your work between ADR UK and different public agencies. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your experience and how you have kind of achieved the success that you have.
Thanks, Doreen. And you read my mind because I was about to raise my hand to build on Helen's response, which actually addresses the question that you have as well. Yes. So when I started doing public engagement at ADR UK, it was in 2021, and we had just launched our ADR England portfolio of work, and public engagement in that space was relatively new and undefined in the sense that no one had the role before me. So it was just kind of speaking to colleagues who were already doing public involvement and engagement, speaking to researchers, speaking to data owners, speaking internally, and trying to balance what's needed, what gaps are there, and how can we do this as responsibly as possible. And something that's really been the backbone of my success is working with NGOs. They have been amazing. I have some NGOs that I've been working with for years, and they have been so brilliant at helping me think about the right language to use when I'm in the room with other NGOs, or when I'm in the room with people with lived experience, helping tinker the types of information that I think is that I'm sharing publicly, to ensure that there's more emphasis on what they want to hear about and maybe less on what isn't necessarily relevant in that space. And around appropriate language, for instance. A really good example of this is that ADR UK recently did some work with Nat Sen on collating some of our research on young people with experience of care. And this was a really beautiful report, and all the projects in the report had, of course, included public engagement. And I'm so grateful that we gave the report to a charity to review, because they picked out language that we needed to change to make sure that the narrative that we're weaving here is appropriate and empowering. And we didn't have the skills to do that internally. And so that was a really good example of how we were able to work with them. And I think I think it can be a bit maybe intimidating when you think of, I don't know, play-based engagement or engagement in person, or whatever that might be. You might not have the time or the resource. And I think it's okay to go to your gatekeeper, your NGO, and just be very honest with them and say, look, this is my box of resources. How can I put something on that within what I have? Like, let's work together to develop something that I'm able to pull off and realize. And that's a lot of what I've been doing. And it's worked really well for me. And yeah, I would always say just start with NGOs.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And yes, we're in awe of all the work that you've done, Shada. So congratulations on really kind of pushing a culture change within kind of the administrative data space. Maybe I can ask the same question of Simon, because I know that you've been in a position where you've been able to actually change organizational culture, leading organizations. So it would be great to get your perspective.
Yeah, I think thank you, Doreen. Shada and Helen, I thought gave really good comprehensive answers to this question. The thing I would add, I think, which is a sort of common thing to both their comments, but I think is really important, is number one, to really work in partnership internally, but also externally. NGOs is a really good example of that. But there are many other partners. And of course, in a sense, we've got two cultures that we're often dealing with, if not more. One is the culture of our own organization, and then there's the wider culture of how science and research works in the UK, and they interplay all the time, but they're not necessarily the same thing. I also think it's really important to think about, which goes to Helen's values point, which is we work and we role model working in a way which is about breaking down silos. It's really easy to mirror the silo that your own organization is working in. I think the really courageous public involvement leads are the ones who say, I am going to actually go out there and build links with other organizations because I know it's going to be good for my organization to do that. So working in partnership beyond your existing boundaries, I think is really crucial. And above all, it's really enriching and very exciting. And I think you get a lot back from it.
Thank you so much. And yeah, really well summarized around the two different cultures that we're negotiating. They're both internal and external. We'll take a very brief comment from Shada before going on to the next question.
Thanks. Sorry, I just wanted to echo Simon's comments, and with the internal change, I think it's also really important to embed public engagement in your sub teams internally as well, rather than seeing it as a separate piece of work. And that doesn't have to be inviting a public contributor to all of your governance meetings or to your team if that's not something that's possible or you're able to do it. But what it does mean is including your public involvement and engagement colleagues in those discussions, in the project planning, because they might have some information around how to meaningfully embed the voice there that won't halt the work, but it will further enrich it and ensure that there is that through line across the organization, just as we want to see across the research projects as well.
Really important point there, Shada, around not having tokenistic involvement for the sake of it and putting it wherever and anywhere you can, but really working through a strategy to make it actually effective and meaningful with good planning from those that are working with the public. So yeah, really good point. Okay, so the next question I have is for Joe and Jan. And the question is, in public involvement and engagement, we know what is important, that it is important to actually be open and to be honest about our work to build trust in what we do. As for Joe, as a data science researcher, how do you think transparency needs to evolve in data research to build genuine trust with the public, especially working with sensitive or complex data like you do? And for Jan, what's the public perspective on this?
Shall I go first? Um, I love how you used evolve as the verb to describe how the idea has to change surrounding transparency. It is, you could still see debates, to be fair, on when or whether transparency is always good. Like in academic realm, like people would argue that, oh, too much transparency is actually harmful because it stops or creates extra barriers or noise, as people might say, like in stopping decisions being made. I don't always agree. I think there is a fundamental value in transparency. It's that social licensing and trust. And that transparency does not correspond to just the end product and how a particular analysis is done, but the whole data pipeline and processes in which pieces of data, which pieces of, well, supposedly public information that has been used to fill that piece of puzzle to generate information, knowledge, and insight that are acted and used by government, by researchers, by third sector parties to change people's lives. And I think it's that level of transparency, not necessarily on transparency in the chosen research method or analytical way, that needs to come into people's minds. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Joe. Very wise words. Jan, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the key aspects of transparency is, and we've already touched on this, is language. Because if you don't understand something, it's very difficult to trust it or trust the people that are involved in it. But I don't just mean around sending a newsletter or sending an email in language that people can understand and that's inclusive, that's incredibly important. But what I'm talking about is when you're involved in research where there are participants and they're taking a tablet every day to see if something happens, and then there's a group that are not taking the tablets, and then you're making that comparison. That's quite an easy concept for most people. But when you're talking about data and when you're talking about big data, and then when you throw natural language processing and AI into the mix, people are mind blown. But I think if we cut that back and we start to think in terms of data telling stories, because each piece of data represents a person, a life, a family, a way of life, a condition, etc. If you think about that in terms of data is telling stories and bringing those stories together will ultimately improve something. It might be health, it might be an administrative thing, but we're all working towards making lives better. So we're doing positive work. But if people don't understand that, then it's very difficult to trust. And I think if you turn that completely on its head, the other thing I think I would like to say at this point is never ever underestimate what the public and patients can actually bring, because they have so much knowledge and they have so much information. But the incredibly difficult job that the PAPI professionals do is unlocking that. So I think there's the two sides of how you get that trust. They need to trust that person to give that information, but they also need to understand what's going on and what data is all about. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you so much for sharing your experience as well. And if we go to Simon.
Yeah, a few points that I was going to add to this, because I think it's a really interesting part of the set of questions that we've got. And I'm mindful that yesterday we saw the Campaign for Science and Engineering publish its latest public attitudes to R&D survey, which is worth looking at. It's very interesting on a number of levels, not least in showing people's willingness to be engaged and involved in R&D at different levels. But the point I was going to draw out of that was that for all the challenges that we face, people do find voices from R&D some of the most trustworthy to listen to and to hear and to see. And so I think part of the way of building and maintaining trust is encouraging our colleagues, not just our R&D colleagues, but others who are working with us, to be visible and to be vocal and to be communicating about the importance of data research, and increasingly, hopefully, about the way that the public have shaped that. I think that's really, really important. But it's, unfortunately, we tend to, because we're all very busy, and lots of things happening for us at any given time in life, we tend to only turn to that when we're in a crisis. And actually, trust is like everything else. You have to keep the water level very high, the reservoir very high, so it's there for a bad day as well as good days. So I think that's a really crucial thing. I think lots already been said about communications and messaging, but I do think that's very important. I think what I find when I've worked with public contributors on this, which I think data researchers, but others as well, will find really helpful, is there an extremely good reality check on not just how to communicate it, but how to work in a way that's going to be more accessible and more meaningful to them. Actually, they're going to help their research go further. It's going to be more trustworthy because it's been rinsed, if you like. Maybe that's not the right term, but it's been through a filter where the public have said this makes it relevant and this makes it more trustworthy because it's more understandable for me and people like me. I think that's a really important job that we have working alongside our research colleagues to ensure that trust is at the highest possible level in individual projects, but also just generally.
Thank you so much. That's a really important point. And I think a backbone, like Joe was saying, to really give that social license for our work a recognition that we are working with people's data and demonstrating that transparency and building that trust is really key and maintaining that social license. So I will welcome brief comments because we're swiftly running out of time. There's so much we could speak about, and I think we can basically have a whole day worth of chatting to you and hearing your perspectives on these questions. So I'll bundle up the next themes into one question. So we're going to be looking at engagement in practice, but also looking at how public voice can influence culture change. So for the next question, I will turn to Helen and ask what you think needs to change at a system or institutional level to make public involvement and engagement the norm rather than just a requirement that's enforced on people.
Oh gosh, it's a small question then. I mean, I have to say, I really admire, Simon, how you've really taken a global view today and sort of talked about being, aware of what we're doing in wider culture change in the whole country and as well as in our institutions. Because I think it needs to be that big a change, really, to be honest. I think there's some really quick wins that sort of surprises me that we don't see, like, proper funding for involvement and engagement before grants go in and before projects start. There used to be a small fund from the RDS to support that research design service, apologies. That doesn't exist anymore. And so it's still the case that we start with this power imbalance, however the researchers might try, in that they've usually done a lot of thinking and a lot of planning. They've started the bus before they get any money to even ask to bring anybody in or to run any public engagement projects. Other quick wins might be seeing, not quick wins, but, people in roles like us just keeping up with our culture change work to recognise this work as important, to celebrate it, to shout it from the rooftops, to make sure that it's part of promotions criteria in research institutions, to make sure that the stories of it and the benefit that it brings is being told, that it's being included in those research excellence framework submissions, that it's just being seen as the skilled work it is. And I think as well, Shazer, just this partnerships, it becomes even more important to grow those. As you mentioned, if you're working in areas where you aren't a sort of part of the cultural background or of the knowledge background or of the even spatial backgrounds of people you're working with, you just rely on experts and people who can welcome you into that. And it's so valuable. And again, recognizing them properly and paying them and thanking them and bringing them into those conversations. So I suppose that would be my sort of quick answer. It's a big question. I'd be really interested to know what everybody else here has to say. But to my mind, certainly doing those things, and then also just having a look about what happens to. We talked so much about trust today and about building trust and stuff, but trust has to be earned as well, doesn't it? So how are we demonstrating that we are trustworthy? How are we holding the big data providers to account? Is there one big case of some public involvement actually making somebody pull out of an unfair saving data sharing agreement or something? I feel could have a very large impact on the media storytelling, or just on the storytelling in general. I suppose demonstrating trust and living in a trustworthy way, rather than it just being a case of, people just need to hear more and we'll convince them. I suppose changing that mindset of it being actually, no, we need to be better in some ways and to demonstrate our, rather than it just being that rather old-fashioned view of communication of research where you just need to explain it better. Going into the more sort of co-produced, power sharing way of meeting people where they are and seeing maybe why there isn't trust and dealing with it.
Thank you so much for that, Helen. And you did mention that Simon's been quite instrumental both at the UK level but globally as well in furthering, this agenda, really to ensure that we democratize research and the public are involved and engaged in research. So it would be great to hear from you, Simon. Sorry to rush you, but we only have a few minutes. So I would like to hear from Simon and Jan as well in terms of the public perspective.
Yeah, so I think very briefly then, I think I want to give something that maybe will be helpful to help people feel that whatever they do in their own local situation is going to have a global impact, and global could be nationally, or but they're contributing to that. And so I think I'd go back to this point about, you know, being visible, making connections, building internal allies, you know, for your work and what you're doing and yourself within an organization. Those are really, really important. And I think also to have a very solutions mindset. So, you know, as you know, Doreen, a lot of my work was been with government. And in fact, my background is as a campaigner, really more than anything else. No campaign works really, or very few campaigns work unless you come to government and others who you want to make a change with solutions. So we've always got to present what we do as solutions to a bigger problem. And we've got to think about it in those terms. And I think at this point in time, we have to recognize that for scientists, they're presented with many pressures and challenges and uh, as people in the health service are or wherever it is, the more we can say this is not the only solution, this is not the entire solution, but what we are doing here is going to help you solve your problems and to solve your problems with us. I think it's really, really, really important because I think people will be more receptive to that than the sense that, oh my gosh, this is another thing I've got to do. I'm already going home at 9 o'clock at night, not seeing my family. Actually, this might mean I can actually go home earlier one day, you know, etc. So we've got to be really solutions minded and present it in those terms. But I think build your allies, make your connections in your own organization and part of the world, because those things will grow exponentially and they'll bump into Helen's connections and then Jan's connections and then Shada's connections and we will build a you know ever bigger community that's saying the same thing and that have more influence in essence.
Thank you so much, Simon. Some very wise words from working with policymakers. I think for me, it's always about the what's in it for me when you're engaging with different stakeholders and trying to, as Simon says, see what the drivers, but also what the challenges are of the people that you have to engage to kind of build that allyship. So I would like to go to Jan to close us off this particular section, but I have one more question for the whole panel. So Jan, you've worked across many organizations. You're a well-known name in this field as a public partner. So from your experience, what does it take to move from involving the public in isolated projects to actually embedding the public voice within the wider organization?
I think there are 2 points for me. I think one is a seismic change within organisations that they actively sell, for want of a better word, why people should do public involvement and engagement with them and draw the public in so they've got people standing by when projects arise, so that the poor person who's doing their very first PPI excursion, there's already a pool of people they can look at and call on. They're not having to go out and search for them or piggyback onto people that other people have used. So the organisations are saying, come and work with us because we can offer you this, this and this, and we really value your input. So I think that's the first thing. The other thing is, Helen's already touched on it, and it's what I'd kind of refer to as wraparound funding, because we've now got this disparity that to get funding for a project, you have to have pre-PPIE and post. But where's that money coming from? So there needs to be a policy and a strategic change. So there's money available to involve the public before you start. And then at the end, you've got to spend your money by a certain date, but then you've got all your papers to write, which the public should be involved with, but they can't be because you can't pay them. And that just seems ridiculous. Don't change the rules in one way, but don't follow it up so it actually, on a practical level, doesn't work. So those are the 2 things for me.
Thank you. Very, very, very strong points there made, and a challenge, I think, to the wider ecosystem, to funders, to institutions as well, in terms of putting your money and infrastructure behind where your mouth is there. So really important point. So now I have one question we're going to ask all panelists, and I'll start with Joe. So what's one thing that both individuals, but also thinking about organizations could do tomorrow to start shifting the culture towards embedding public involvement and engagement?
My answer would be for individuals and organizations to be creative. I think that hasn't been possible or hasn't been easy for individuals and organizations. For individuals, this is about thinking about ways to, sell your message and meet people at different levels and make sure you're communicating in ways in which that's acceptable, um, no matter complex or easy the message you want to tell. For organizations, this is about quite or change really from the sort of standards or routines into something that's, I think, widely recognized as a better practice. So some simple things like whether conferences would welcome public contributors to attend. I can't believe that's still a problem that we're constantly facing or arguing against. Organizations, like Helen mentioned, creativity in recognizing job descriptions, different roles, what Jen has said, intermediate grants, money that needs to be there before a formal PPIE project could begin. It's like creativity and thinking and planning that organizations really do have to take on board and take risk in people, in the researchers and in the public, and trusting that more fruition would come from it. So be creative is my suggestion.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. A really important point. We found that's worked so well in our engagement activities, being creative. In view of time and wanting to answer questions or give the audience an opportunity to ask their questions, maybe if we could just stick to one thing. I know it's very tempting to say everything, but let's do a round robin of one thing for everybody else. So if I go to Shada.
Thank you. For people who haven't tried public engagement before, be brave. The worst that can happen is that you learn from your attempt and try again.
And I would add to Shada's of be honest as well when things don't work and put it out there. I think people are very forgiving when you actually are honest in saying that we tried this, it didn't work. So yeah,
Absolutely.
totally agree.
And it's helpful for us to know what didn't work so that we can learn too.
Exactly. And if I could go to Helen next.
I suppose I would say share power. Think about where you have the power. If that's someone who's just starting trying engagement or involvement, or somebody who's coming in to do some for the first time, be willing to find a compromise, be willing to find a point where you meet in the middle, and magical things can happen.
I like that. Simon.
So I would say find and identify a champion on your board of your organization, someone who's going to make the case, advance your work, protect it on occasion, maybe with their board colleagues. So it's really part of how they consider making decisions about the organization as leaders, but also it translates into organizational strategy that's supportive of what you're doing rather than toxic to it.
Thank you so much, Simon. I think that's something we can all bear in mind as we continue trying to embed public involvement in our organizations. And finally, Jan.
Yeah, Shada said what I was going to say, which was be brave, be bold, and be afraid to fail. But I think the one thing I would say that PPI needs at organizational, strategic, and leadership level more than anything else is time, because it takes 2 or 3 times longer than you think it's going to take. But what you get back is magical, it is rich, and it will change your research and possibly your life as well. So I think that's where I'd go.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Joe, for giving us a good rounding and everybody else for building on that response. So we will now move to Q&A, and we have Q&A until about 14:40. So I will ask the question that's been most upvoted and then leave a member of the panel that wants to take that question to put their hand up to take that question. So the first question is, how can we meaningfully engage people in scientific discussions on complex topics such as the ethical use of tools such as generative AI? Any takers for that one? Shada.
Thanks, Doreen. This is a really good question. It's a really big challenge, and we haven't solved it, but we have worked in ways that has helped us get to that point in particular cases. And what I would advise is it's really helpful if you can work with a public panel. There are loads of public panels. Loads of organizations have one. AGR UK has one. It's open to anyone who wants to engage with it and test some messaging there. You can also test messaging with NGOs around if you're engaging with particular groups of people. It's you cannot in good faith have an engagement session with the public and then be like, oh, the public said this, if they didn't understand what you are trying to, if they didn't understand your concepts, if they didn't understand what you meant by data and AI. Try and story tell and frame things in ways that people understand in their sort of everyday lives, use case studies and metaphors to get away from that very, very technical language and move into a place that we can conceptually bridge gaps, because we do that all the time. I mean, there was a point when all of us had never heard of AI, right? And our understanding of AI, just as an example, came from our lived experience of other things. So it's kind of working within that frame. But I would definitely say try and speak to a public panel if you can. They can really, really help with fleshing out that message and helping you focus on the details that you need to focus on and exclude any extra information that can be burdensome and not necessary.
Thank you, Shada. And Jan?
Yeah, I would just say two things. I think one is be aware that it's an ever-changing system, and what you tell someone today could be out of date by tomorrow. And also that there is so much rubbish available on this topic that you need to wade through first.
Thank you very much. And just to add on, I think to Shada and Jan and Shada's point around public panels, there's also been some deliberative activity. So this is where you engage people more than once, because as I think as Jan had said about the fact that this takes time, and I think Joe had said about in his answer to the complexity, you do need the time to build that knowledge so that people are operating on more of that shared power model that Helen brought up, to really explain terms, to engage with people, let them absorb this and come and make a contribution that is based on mutual understanding. So I think there is that as well. And perhaps introducing more of that deliberative type engagements within PPIE, because I think sometimes we do tend to focus on one-time engagements with the public. Helen?
Oh yes, just because you mentioned that, we actually, it wasn't around AI, but the Co-Production Collective were involved in some public deliberation events. I'll put the blog post that we wrote about it in the chat for people if you're interested, around data use in reproductive healthcare. And it's exactly as you said, sort of, there is a lot of making sure you're all speaking the same language that you have to get to in these things. And so using processes like that was really valuable there, I think.
Totally agree. Okay, so I'll move on to the next question. And this is an interesting one. It says, how can we make PPIE conversations about data research mutually beneficial, specifically for the public? What do they get from this type of involvement? So maybe we can go to Helen.
No, thank you. I work in public engagement, so we're always thinking about things being mutually beneficial. And I think it's a really good question because, and it's often a question that isn't asked. So thank you for asking it. It's often, what can I extract and get? We've done a piece of work, talking to people about why they take part in engagement and involvement. We've done several actually over the years. And a huge amount of the benefit that people report to us that they get from it is actually the sheer and cheesy feeling that you're helping to make research better, that you're helping to improve lives and improve knowledge. But I think there's also some quite practical things that you can try and make sure that it benefits. As I think I've mentioned a few times today, I think one of the best benefits that can be is actually acting on what people have said. So making it better based on what they've asked you to do. That is a benefit. There's also the point that a few of us have raised, Joe, you mentioned too, about paying people and making sure that they monetarily benefit from their work and from the time they've given, at least as much as you're benefiting if you're doing this as part of your paid work. And I think above and beyond sort of any of those benefits, really, I think is like reporting back. We've talked about storytelling a lot today, so I don't want to sort of talk storytelling, but I think that's, you said we did phrase that comes out of NHS practice a lot. It's a real powerful moment. I've done a little bit of this work in myself as a private life, just to be told that, you know, something that you did actually did lead to a change. And so making sure that you're keeping in touch with people and that they're hearing about that. Like for me, I think that's one of the bigger benefits you can get. I'd be really, really interested to know what this cohort says as well, though.
Did anybody want to come in with a quick comment on that? I thought Helen covered that really well. And with my health data research hat on, there's other things that you can negotiate with your institute depending on the person. Because I think the point that, you know, Simon brought out around knowing your audience or your stakeholder and developing a relationship, it's useful to establish what would be beneficial to each particular person. Some universities have given people access to courses, upskilling, things that has then helped people to get jobs and things, presentation skills, or people might want access to a library. And some people have even ensured that, you know, skills were learned that that could benefit the individual. So there's lots of different things. And I think it's really a discussion with the members of the public that you're engaging. If you are engaging at large, as Helen has said, I think it's really crucial to try to think outside the box. You might go there with your project, but think about what the community needs. And you might not be the best person to solve that issue, but it's who can you link them to, or how can you help them be made heard as well in terms of building that capacity. We will go to Joseph and Jan and then maybe take one more question.
I think Jan has your hand up first, so Jan, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I was just going to say this is completely and utterly personal, but for me, having done various PPI roles over the last 5-6 years, it's absolutely amazing what you learn about yourself and what you didn't realize you knew and could contribute to, but also the empathy that you build up with other people in PPI groups, with shared events, shared conditions, and things like that, and the strength you can gain from that. So I think there's some very personal things as well as the professional things, and I would totally agree. I've spoken at conferences, which I would never have envisaged doing had it not been for getting involved in this environment. So I think there's a lot that you can gain.
What's been your number one enjoyment, Jan, across all of your work?
Oh, crikey, that's a difficult one. I think when you actually realize that you do make a difference, that you say something, and then in the next iteration of something, you think, oh, I said that, and now it's been included. And that is incredibly empowering. So, and it might only be something small, but that doesn't matter. But it's incredibly empowering that you were heard and people have acted on what you've thought.
Thank you. And I think for me, that reinforces a point you raised in our work, actually, Jan, around that you said I did piece, and making sure that that does get back to members of the public, because you're so right. I think that makes a difference, not only to members of the public, but to all of us in seeing the fact that we have been able to achieve change. Joe?
Yeah, I just want to raise a few examples. Some of my colleagues has brilliant work, like working with the public engagement group to develop like causal diagrams, so helping devising analytical frameworks. And well, my other point is, again, being creative, right? Understanding being a researcher does give you a lot of power and options in how you can discover like identities and thoughts and develop along with the public panel or people that you're working with. So I remember a young people that I worked with turns out to be a really good illustrator, and then I found an opportunity to link him up with a separate journal who then commissioned him in producing some art pieces for my article that goes along with that, like with that piece of art. So I think it's things like this that researchers don't often realize, sometimes self-limit themselves in how they think they can match and work with the public in, identifying what's beneficial the most for the individual.
Yeah, a really important point, Joe. That thinking outside the box and thinking about other ways that you can help the community and people. Okay, so we'll take one more question. Oh, sorry, Shada, did you want to come in?
I just wanted to add one quick thing, which was talk to your friends and family as well. Like, just go to your network. We're all working in such an interesting space. And if you have a project that's interesting and you want to do some public engagement around it, test your messaging with someone at home or one of your friends at the pub, because if you can get it through a conversation like that, then chances are you can successfully engage in the same way to a bigger group of members of the public, quote unquote, non-data experts, but not data experts.
Thank you very much, Shada. So we'll go to the next question, and this is around the value that organizations place on public involvement and engagement professionals. So there's a question around the fact that they often have short-term contracts, which might indicate that the institutions they're based in might not value that role. So the question was what the panel thinks about this. So how can we help organizations move towards a more proactive approach and away from what is commonly reactive, which is getting in the PPIE when you need it, the person or staff member. Any comments around what I think is a change in culture in terms of value, but I think there's also a question here about funding. So any takers for this question?
Oh, sorry, Jan.
I would just say a couple of brief things. I think organizational leadership have to acknowledge the incredibly challenging and complex work that professionals do. And I think one of the greatest things that organizations can give in this area is continuity. So if you have people on short-term contracts, there is no continuity, and those people are constantly under stress looking where their next job is going to come from. So that doesn't work in this space.
And I think going back to the point that Simon had raised about the two different culture streams, I think this is a wider issue in research where it's not just the PPIE professionals, but of course researchers face the same issue as well. But yes, it can limit the engagement with communities, as often the person that's done all that linkage with the communities then leaves, and then you almost have to start all over again. Joe?
This is not a very mature thought, but the idea is if organizations can treat public engagement as a proper science, as a practice that requires expertise and time and investment, and maybe in their existing framework, they can sort of fund it more appropriately.
Thank you very much. That's a great response. And I see an agreement in the chat as well, 100%, Joseph. So I have a question. Maybe we can direct this one to Simon and anybody else who would like to come in, because it's a big question, Simon. How do we bridge the gap between science, policy, and society? On this note, how can we communicate scientific findings and their potential weaknesses in a transparent way?
Yes, that is a big question. And I think it points to a lot of the work that Sense About Science does in this space. And some of you may know that we had Evidence Week last week where we were in Parliament and research teams were presenting their work in sort of speed briefing sessions with parliamentarians in their offices. And it was very, very successful. That's a very good example of work that we need to do generally. I think things like the new clinical trials regulations, where there's a new duty to feedback and report, are going to help us. And we should make sure we use these sorts of things as levers to encourage people to put evidence out there in the most honest and open fashion, even if it's evidence that people are not necessarily going to like or agree with. I think it's really, really important that we're brave enough to do that. So I think using things like that as a lever is really, really important. I think it's also important that we organizations, as part of their strategy, have a very good approach to their comms and how they present evidence to the outside world. And but keeping it very purpose focused. So even though we're talking about something very complex like data, at the end of the day, all we're talking about is another way of helping people become better or be better or get healthy or die well, all those sorts of things. So, let's make sure that we connect it all the time to the purpose behind essentially what we're doing. So big question. many different answers, I think. And I think lastly that we work collaboratively to do that, and to present and to get our evidence in the best possible fashion that's going to be helpful to people.
Thank you so much, Simon, and thank you so much to everyone for your wisdom and sharing your experiences of working in different fields with different stakeholders. That was a really, really rich discussion. So thank you so much for joining us as panelists today. And thank you everyone as well for sending in your questions. We weren't able to get to all of the questions, but we're going to discuss these with the speakers, and then we're going to produce a Q&A document that we will leave on the website. So thank you so much, everyone, and a special thank you as well to our panelists.